Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, October 20th, and you are at the Kubernetes SIG Testing bi-weekly meeting. I am your host today, Aaron Krickenberger, also known as SpiffXP on GitHub, Slack, and all the places. We're all going to adhere to the Kubernetes Code of Conduct during this meeting. If you have any questions or concerns with my behavior or the behavior of others, you're welcome to reach out to me or conduct@kubernetes.io. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted publicly to YouTube as soon as Zoom and YouTube have finished processing it. So I put a couple things to just kind of revisit on today's agenda based on our discussion last week. So I guess I can share my screen to kick us off, if that's cool with folks. Let's see. Cool. I think you're looking at the meeting notes. So first up, I wanted to talk about the upcoming Docker Hub changes that are rolling out November 1st. So the TLDR is in the issue description here. Basically, as of November 1st, Docker is going to rate limit pull requests of images from Docker Hub. If we don't authenticate, it'll be rate limited by IP address, which works out to about 16 pulls an hour. If we're authenticated, it'll limit us to about 33 pulls an hour. And if we use a paid plan, somehow we get unlimited. The concern here is that this rate limit applies across all images. So if we focus on the images that are pulled most frequently, as I'll show below, I think we're okay. But the concern may be that the long tail of jobs that run across the build cluster may end up causing random nodes to start getting rate limited by their IP address. So some ideas we kicked around last time were to invest in a pool of paid Docker Hub accounts that we could distribute to all of the nodes in all of our build clusters, as well as all of the clusters that we stand up for E2E test. My quick look at this is that it's going to be a lot of plumbing to do so, but that may be an option worth investigating. Another idea folks suggested was implementing some kind of pull-through cache, which again, we'd have to hook up to all of the build nodes as well as all of the clusters under test. For mitigation, we decided we should sort of audit all of our tests and image builds and see just how bad the situation is. And we should generally advise people to not use Docker Hub and instead use cates.gcr.io, which is the image registry or repository that the project provides for everybody. So Antonio rightly honed in on all of the images used under Kubernetes, which works out to these. I sort of found the same thing by going and looking at the kubelet logs from a cluster under test and saw that these were all of, at least for the default job, these were all of the images that were pulled from Docker on a given cluster under test. And then I tried to survey the default build cluster within google.com, but did not have the appropriate credentials or time to survey that. So then I sort of surveyed all of our job configs to see what are all of the images that are used that are not hosted by gcr.io. You can see a lot of Golang and Node and Python and Alpine and stuff. So we looked a little bit further, and Google Cloud provides something called mirror.gcr.io, which is sort of a pull-through cache, but only for really high traffic images that are pulled through from Docker Hub. I forget if it has the full list here, but the TLDR is that any GKE cluster that is stood up is automatically configured to pull from mirror.gcr.io first before it goes and hits Docker Hub. So this means that all of these high traffic images like Node and Python and Golang should be totally fine. It's not something we need to explicitly specify in our job configs. We're just gonna get that for free. It includes pretty much all of the images that Antonio laid out here, including Alpine and Nginx and Perl and Redis, which I think maybe Arnaud kind of verified later down here in the comment stream. CloudU raised an interesting point that mirror.gcr.io may not necessarily mirror multi-arch requests. And he also reminded us that there are dedicated plans for open source projects, which I had started investigating right after last meeting. And I needed to gather some more data on exactly how many images we pulled where and why. So I kind of stalled out on submitting this, but I was going to continue to follow through on this as a possibility for getting us a paid plan for unlimited pulls. That's sort of where we are. What do people think we should do for next steps?
Is there somebody here who knows a bit more about the multi-arch use case? Because that part I didn't quite get. Like, it seems to me that for the common things, like mirror.gcr.io would work. And so I'm not sure why for a multi-arch solution it wouldn't.
Oh, Claudia, you're here. Why don't you pick that one up?
Yeah, sorry, I just joined. So I checked the images on mirror.gcr.io, and they are not manifest lists, which means that those images are only for Linux AMD 64. From what I've checked, there aren't a lot of jobs which are currently using the other architecture types. So for most scenarios, it should be fine. But I think there are still too many of them which will require some solution for that. So your question was, what about multi-arch, right?
Yeah, I think it makes sense that by multi-arch you mean different architectures. That makes a lot of sense now. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that. I used some a buzzword there. Please do call me out when I do that.
I've actually listed here the jobs that are using other architecture types. Most of them are, there are three periodic jobs, a couple of pre-submits, and a couple of SIG node jobs that I'm not sure if they're periodic or pre-submits or something like that.
I think most of the stuff that's not AMD 64 is not even on like RCI at all. I think we should also step back and acknowledge that mirror.gcr.io is like a mitigation. It may help us avoid pain, but it's certainly not a solution, because even if we didn't have the multi-arch problem, it may not necessarily mirror the images we use. Mm-hmm. There's no guarantee on that. It's just an additional cache that happens to be fast that we can very trivially roll out to CI and help mitigate some of what's going on in our CI. It doesn't help, for example, end users that need to pull it on in their own environments. I think we still ultimately either need to get our Docker Hub such that it's not rate limited, if that's possible, or any of the ones we use, or move off of it. So another thing is, I think most of these images that we've been talking about are in the Docker like library namespace, and I'd be somewhat surprised if Docker shot themselves in the foot rate limiting that, since it's like their own registry there.
That's a good question. From Docker, we only care about 5 images, which are most commonly used in conformance tests. And those are in the Docker Hub library, as I mentioned. Those are the BusyBox image, 2 versions of HTTPD, and 2 versions of Nginx. I'm currently looking into trying to remove the HTTPD image usage. There aren't a lot of them. There are only a few cases which they are used, and in most cases they are used in rolling upgrades tests. So I was wondering if I could make it use the Nginx images instead. So that would be, get from 5 to 3 images. I'm currently investigating this as well because we are also confronted with this issue for the Windows test jobs, because we are currently hosting those images on Docker Hub before we finish all the Windows test image support. And I saw in the Docker Hub FAQ that they are willing to support open source projects. And I think by this they mean that they could give out accounts which are not rate limited. And this is something that we are currently investigating and seeing if we are going to be able to get some accounts like that.
My concern is that unless, I don't know that anybody has confirmed this to me yet, but unless I read along, my initial impression was that the rate limiting is per client. So if we get an account that's not rate limited, that could be used by like CI. But it doesn't solve the problem that like we have tools that are built around rate limited images. So then like all of our users will need to do the same thing. And also more specifically, someone from Docker commented on a thread a while back and mentioned contacting the CNCF related to that sort of account. I don't know that anybody in the Kubernetes space has actually done that yet.
I've been looking into it, but like I said, that stalled out on my end. So I apologize for not moving forward on that. But like I said, what would need to happen for that to be completely effective is to plumb that account and those credentials through everything. My concern, just personally speaking, is I want to make sure that all of our PR traffic against Kubernetes does not grind to a halt on November 1st. So I'm principally concerned with making sure that all of the CI jobs that are merge blocking and release blocking for Kubernetes work. Then expanding out from there, we can talk about CI jobs that involve Kubernetes, but live on other boards. So here I'm talking about cluster API jobs. I'm talking about COPS jobs. Alternate the AKS engine jobs. Alternate means of provisioning a cluster may require alternate means of plumbing the credentials through. Expanding out from there, you could talk about CI for all of our 100 and something sub projects. And there, I feel like we may have most of the common cases captured, and we should advise people on how to move to gcr.io or something else, and just let them know that they may be experiencing some bumps in the interim. And then and only then do I personally start caring about the experience of our developers and making sure that we don't have anything that's causing a developer's machine to get rate limited. Because I feel like developers, they can authenticate and at least get the 200 per 6 hours instead of 100 per 6 hours. So that's something. Other concerns I have about stuff running in CI, which I tried to list here in the notes. Ben, maybe you want to articulate some of this. A lot of the things I believe we have covered are all of the jobs that end up using clustered kubeup.sh. But not all of those jobs. There are other jobs that use Docker and Docker. We also have other release blocking and merge blocking jobs that use kind. And it is unclear to me that those will gain the benefits from mirror.gcr.io that everything else would.
So Docker and Docker should be trivial if we haven't done it already. I think I actually did already. I just need to confirm before this comes up to enable mirror.gcr.io. It's a really simple configuration change, and we control that. For kind, it's a bit of a layering violation to be using that because it doesn't necessarily make sense for all users, and it's not clear how it would inherit that from the host. We may have to think a bit about how we do that. I think for the E2E tests, that's probably the main thing. So like all of the image builds and whatnot for core Kubernetes don't use all of the things we run in pre-submit or post-submit don't use it. The only things that do are like, say, the E2E image or something, which is built much more infrequently. But we have the images that we use for E2E pods that Claudia was mentioning. For those, I think we probably want to get those onto cates.gcr.io. So another thing that hasn't come up yet is we might look at extending the image promoter system to allow promoting images that we don't control into some registry, like at least a staging one or something, something along those lines that we can use for things like E2E, so that we don't actually have to host our own sourced Nginx image, but we can maybe copy it from Docker Hub to somewhere that we know won't be rate limited, but we already have the like credentials for and whatnot.
So similar to what I suggested last week for the BusyBox image, right?
Yeah, I think so. I apologize. I'm drowning in it.
Stop sharing real quick just so we can see faces while we're talking. So my impression is the image promoter right now doesn't support promoting from arbitrary registries. I think it only supports promoting from gcr.io. I would see nothing wrong with setting up jobs that are just, that have a very basic Docker file that's from the Docker Hub hosted image and ends up landing in a staging repo. My thought would be the E2E test images staging repo that we're already using for things like AGN host and all of the other images that are used by our E2E tests. Does that sound like a fair suggestion?
I actually think it would be relatively straightforward to just, I mean, even without a Docker image, we could just write some like cloud build jobs that just like push to staging, like pull tag push, or something along those lines, or even someone that has credentials could do it manually. I think we allow manual pushes to the staging registries, and then promote those. Or serve out of staging. I forget if that's problematic or not. If just as possibly an option if we have some concerns about like why is cates.gcr.io hosting like BusyBox or something, it might make sense to just leave it in the E2E staging images, which are a little bit less visible.
Okay. So it sounds like one concrete task that I will own is reaching out to Docker Hub and the CNCF to look at either an open source set of accounts or paid accounts. Who wants to help with figuring out how we would plumb those credentials through to everything? All right, I think I saw a hand from Ben.
Yeah, I probably know that best. I'd be curious to know up front if there's any possibility of like setting up registries that aren't rate limited on that end, or if it does have to be the client. If it has to be the client, then yeah, we'll need to plumb that through.
Based on my read of the FAQ, it has to be the client.
That's my read as well. But if we do wind up talking to Docker Hub, I'd like to confirm that, because that is not as nice for users versus something like GCR where we can just pay on the hosting side and not make all of our users worry about it.
Right. And so that would lead me to, it sounds like a good stopgap for Kubernetes would be to take all the images that are used in E2E tests, set up a cloud build job that pushes those into the E2E test images staging repo. Does anybody want to take the lead on that?
I already started with the BusyBox image. I can just amend the pull request to also address the other images as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I already tagged you on the BusyBox pull request.
If we drop that, can you send me like a ping periodically on Slack or something? GitHub notifications have been a bit of a tire fire for me.
Yeah.
I'm pretty responsible.
I'll also copy the link in chat.
Thank you.
And I'll update this pull request with the other images as well. For example, for the BusyBox image is just a no-op Docker file. And after that, it just creates the manifest list and pushes to the staging repo, registry, sorry.
Okay. Have I left anything out?
Are there any other open source projects dealing with the same issue right now that we could reach out to? I'm assuming that other people have this issue.
I think most projects move to alternative free hosts, like Quay, or possibly or GitHub's package registry. I think we should look at those for summer usage, but we may not be as inclined to migrate to that versus, say, GCR, which we kind of already have tooling around and whatnot.
I've been trying to look at the GCR.io public registries, if they contain images that we could use or is useful for the E2E tests. I found a couple of them which had BusyBox image and Nginx and so on, but they're not manifest lists, which means that there are no images for other architecture types on GCR.io for BusyBox and Nginx, which doesn't really help a lot.
Okay. And then I feel like the only open question I have is what do we need to do for kind?
Yeah, that one's been a bit more of a sticking point. I would say for most of our upstream stuff, like the E2E images, that it makes sense to host them alongside other things in case.gcr.io if we need. For kind, we risk causing issues with our Chinese contributor and user base, which so far have been able to rely on being able to create a Kubernetes cluster by pulling one image from Docker Hub, which is actually available behind the Great Firewall. So just moving to case.gcr.io is not a great one there. The other thing is we actually have been using mutable tags for the moment, which is not something the image promoter allows. Bit TBD on what we should do for that one. And then there's also, like, if we were going to rely on mir.gcr.io, we may need to look at in what way would it make sense to plumb that through in CI, or any special like Docker pull credentials or whatever, which should both be doable. I'm just not sure how we want to do it. I think the next thing I want to do is investigate the GitHub registry, because I think that's also a potentially attractive option for our smaller projects that don't necessarily need to be like hosted in case.gcr.io or have all the promotion and whatnot. There are some projects that are, using GitHub Actions. It may be nice if they can just do that, have all the credentials handled for them, and no fuss. I've heard it's supposed to be available, but I need to confirm more about how well it works. I'm not sure if that's an option we should move forward on, but I want to investigate it.
That sounds worthwhile. My knowledge is probably a couple months outdated, but I feel like the release engineering team was messing around with this for a little while, and they found that GitHub's package registry was too flaky when it came to pulling artifacts reliably.
Interesting. Well, I also believe they've had a major rewrite, which is part of why I've waited. You couldn't pull by digest, which was a non-starter for both my own concerns around pinning images and containerd, which always derefs the digest and pulls by digest. So I'm not sure if that fix rolled out yet, but my understanding that involved a pretty substantial rewrite. So I've been meaning to check it, post that, and there's been fairly recent movement on that. It was in beta. I'm not sure if it released yet.
Okay. I kind of want to move us forward in the agenda. Do we have any other open questions on Docker Hub? Okay. So this brings me to my next open question. I sent out an email thread about this a little while ago. We are going to not have our regularly scheduled meeting on November 3rd, just because that coincides with the US election. A number of other SIGs have also sort of canceled or deferred their meetings. When I started looking at scheduling, the next meeting after that, as regularly scheduled, falls during KubeCon. And I imagine people might be elsewhere or otherwise occupied. So my question to folks is, we could have no meetings in November. Our next regularly scheduled meeting would fall on December 1st. My thought was, given everything we've just discussed about Docker Hub, it might be worthwhile to have a meeting on November 10th, just to kind of see where we're at as far as mitigating the Docker Hub stuff. And the other option is, if we're shifting one meeting off by a week, we could have another meeting 2 weeks from then, November 24th. Do people have any strong opinions on how many meetings we should have in the month of November and when we should have them?
I do think we should at least have one, and I do think it's a good idea to move them around these events, which we're otherwise going to have understandable attendance issues with. I don't know if we need all of them. I think the end of the year is usually a slow time anyhow, but we actually seem to have a number of things to discuss at the moment. In particular, I think Docker Hub's issues roll out between now and the next possible one. It'd probably be good to have a meeting after that to just circle back with everyone on this.
Okay, I'm going to say we have one. Cool. So my suggestion would be, we have one meeting during November. It would be November 10th. And then our next meeting would be December 1st, post KubeCon, post Thanksgiving for some people. Going once, twice. Sold. All right. I will reschedule the November 3rd meeting to November 10th and delete the other meeting. Okay. Next thing on the agenda, I'll share my screen for this again, is just to kind of check back in on where we are at with CI policy updates. So we've kind of stalled out on rolling out everything that was suggested in the CI policy updates. The main concern for me is finishing out, making sure that all the release blocking jobs have to run in a dedicated cluster over in Kate's infra, and the same for the merge blocking jobs. And the only jobs that remain are the build jobs. I tried to lay out what next steps are supposed to be for all the build jobs. To recap, there are two Google Cloud buckets, Kubernetes Release Dev and Kubernetes Release Poll, which live in a Google-owned project that only allows google.com accounts to write to it. And due to the nature of that project, we can't use it. So we're going to have to migrate to new buckets in a new project. So I proposed the replacement buckets, Kate's Release Dev and Kate's Release Poll. And what we need to do now are create jobs that write to those new buckets, and then start changing over jobs to consume the builds that are placed in those buckets. And so I think Carlos from the release engineering team created a canary job for the build fast job. And Arnaud has opened up a PR for the build job. This is just for release blocking, right? And so now the next step is to have jobs consume those artifacts. So once I was curious what the holdup was on implementing that, and when I went looking, I discovered that kubetest had a bunch of hard-coded locations in it. So I added this pull request to add flags to tell kubetest where to extract its release artifacts from. And my plan was to change over a job this afternoon. And if that looks good, I think we should change all of the other jobs over. The complication with the build job is that we discovered it doesn't just write its artifacts to a Google Cloud bucket. It also has this flag. It publishes images to a GCR repo called Kubernetes CI images. I have no idea what project owns that repo, so it's unclear to me whether we would be allowed to continue to write to that, or if we would need to create a new staging repo to write to. Would anybody be interested in investigating that?
I could take some time to look into that.
Okay, thanks, Grant. At the time, I tried to go look to see like what are these images and what are they used by. Code search was down at the time, but I think I grepped around in the Kubernetes code base, and it looks like kubeadm makes some references to it. So I'm assuming that means most of the cluster API providers probably have that repo hard-coded somewhere in them, and they may need to be. We have to figure out if they have flags to specify another repo to pull their images from. And if so, plumb all that stuff through. But for now, I'm just concerned with making sure this job can write its images to someplace. Assuming we take care of that, I think we are good. Like, I think we'll have then, this is, just to be clear, this is something that like does not require any google.com access to do. It just requires somebody to make the changes to the jobs and babysit them more or less and make sure that they look okay. So it is my hope that this is something the release engineering team, maybe the CI signal team could help out with. And I think we'd be able to finally close out the big three from our original policy issue, which I'm trying to find right now. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to migrate back up to the umbrella issue. So then that leaves us with these other three issues that we had discussed, which was mandating that every job that runs on Prow has contact info, and also setting up a policy of removing jobs that were just continuously failing. Rob, I hate to put you on the spot, but I feel like this is something that had been discussed by the CI signal folks over in SIG release. Do you have any updates on that?
On which issue is this now? I was just thinking about the previous one that you were talking. I'm just going to say that I'm happy to work on those build jobs, but I think you've moved on.
Yes, I had. Sorry. So if we finish out the build jobs, we'll have finished out the top three, right? Yeah. And so then the other things that could happen right now, too, in fact, are mandating that all the Proud jobs have contact info. So this issue.
We both had a look at this a while back, yeah.
Yeah, and then sort of removing any jobs that are just egregiously failing forever, like that maybe is a signal that nobody's actually maintaining them or watching them. So that's sort of like, this is the Band-Aid or the stopgap. And then how would we carry this policy forward? So how would we declare, look, if your job is failing for more than N days or N weeks, we're going to remove it. So figuring out what that policy should be and crafting it and rolling it out.
Yeah, I think it's I suppose from our point of view, like I agree with the policy, and I suppose I'd be concerned about doing that in such a way that we explain the policy to the community, and suppose there's yeah, there's multiple ways of going about this. I think I'd have to take guidance on what the best way to publish the policy will be and communicate that. But I presume just sending out, you're formulating the policy here, which I think is reasonably straightforward. We can put some numbers on how long a job takes to continuously fail, whereby we go, okay, right, this is suspect, and publish a policy, and then just announce it and then implement it. So is there anything here that's really fundamentally hard?
Not that I'm aware of, right?
Yeah.
So just to recap, we've got this query is run daily, and it shows which jobs have been failing the longest. So we probably have a couple. These would be probably the egregiously failing jobs that have been failing for coming up on 900 days for some of these. And we could probably have something that just looks at this periodically and could generate a report or send an email out or something. In terms of order of operations, so generally we blast stuff out to Kubernetes dev when we're announcing policies, looking for comments on them, allowing enough time for lazy consensus. But another thing that could be helpful to do here is like to help figure out who owns these jobs. We could maybe establish who owns the jobs and then not just send to Kubernetes dev, but also send to those SIGs or those people specifically as maybe a way to raise signal. So it could be that we want to finish this issue first.
Yeah.
And my rough guess at how I would assign ownership would be to just take a look at where the jobs are in test grid right now. Whoops, that's not going to work. Sort of when we were working on, measuring how we were doing on CI policy, I'd created the proud job report tool in test infra under the experiments directory, which outputs a bunch of stuff to CSV, and then I imported that into Google Sheets. And so that report lists all of the dashboards that a job, or it takes a good guess at which dashboard that job should belong to. So for cases where jobs have multiple dashboards assigned to them, the most important dashboard is whether or not it's on SIG release master blocking or not, right? But then secondarily, like which other SIG name or work group name does that job belong to? So like the evil noisy approach we could take is just assume that if it's on your dashboard, you own it. And then we put your SIG's mailing list as the alert address. And then we say, you're going to get alerts for these jobs. Do you want to continue to get alerts for them? If you don't, you can either fix the job or you could remove the job. Something like that. Okay. But that would also give us just a quick way to like know which SIG we should CC for which jobs, sort of.
Let me take a look at this. I backed away from this from a time to break the back in the report, and I'm this week I'm hopefully going to finish out the status report, and I'll get stuck back into this and figure some things out.
Sure.
Yeah.
My thought is this could be oh, sorry, I see stuff in chat too. Arnaud, were you saying you wanted to work on this or something else? I missed that.
I think it was the previous item.
Okay. But like this, I think CI Signal has a bunch of shadows too, so it could be a great thing to point them at. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of subs on the bench, as I said before. We could perhaps talk about this offline if that was okay. And
sure.
Then, and we'll I'll raise an army to work through this. I think yeah, once we establish the policy and then decide what actions need to be taken to implement it, yeah, we can get a few people on it. No problem.
Okay. Any other questions, comments, or concerns on the CI policy stuff? All right. I super appreciate everybody's help in rolling this out. I think it's pretty clear. CI's gotten a lot better in the project since then. I know I locally have this Grafana instance that I'm running. Eventually, one day, maybe I'll figure out how to actually get it up in the cloud and make sure the credentials aren't broken. I appear not to have it running on this laptop. My bad, I forgot. But you can really obviously see how the times were super wacky back in July and August, and they've really come down and stabilized just in terms of overall duration of the jobs. Okay, I see some other items popped up on the agenda while we were talking. Hippie, do you want to speak to the release blocking job?
Sure. The release blocking job, we originally ran that .cncf.io, and it was able to function. But I think the first two links there were where it succeeds on our PROW and it fails on the Kubernetes PROW. And we tried 3 different variations on it just to make sure, but there's something slightly different. I suspect it's in the sidecar, maybe the, I think there's like decorators, and we weren't able to get decorators working on our PROW config yet. And one of the decorator things is the entry point. So possibly there's some different behavior on entry point. I think I also included a link to our Docker image or the code underlying it. I would love some help because this is our signal to say don't release this version of Kubernetes because we still have untested GA endpoints that were added this release.
So just out of curiosity, it looks like you have this entry point script down here that tries switching to the Postgres user. Have we tried that on?
It seems to work on all variations on our side. And it's just been difficult to understand what's happening when it's running the, go ahead.
Are you saying that you are running it without the pod utilities in your cluster and you're running it with the pod utilities in our cluster?
That's correct.
Yeah, so I would guess then that it is, so the entry point mechanism in a Docker file that says run this as the entry point, and then you can have like arguments to it dynamically. The pod utilities does not respect the entry point in your image. It totally overrides it. So it's probably something in there.
Like I guarantee what this output is here is the entry point container provided by pod utils. So first off, the purpose of the entry point container is to be able to automatically wrap the command of the test container that you're providing. And then it will take standard output from that and dump it to the build log, which gets uploaded to GCS. And it's also responsible for automatically uploading anything that lands in the artifacts directory to GCS. So if we don't use the entry point container, you don't get any logs. The entry point container almost undoubtedly runs as root. So I think what Ben and I are trying to say is one suggestion is to, on your CNCF PROW, try using pod utils. That way you could debug it there where you have maybe more access to the nodes and the cluster. And you could maybe have the command that you use for the container be this, like be the script that tries switching to the Postgres user before it runs stuff. This is my lack of Kubernetes knowledge showing. What I don't know is whether like a security context is going to yell at you for doing this.
I don't think we have jobs doing currently, but you also probably can just set the user ID on the container in the pod spec in the PROW job. You'll just need to find out what UID that is.
So we did go through the
Yeah,
approach of trying to set the user ID on the test container. Entry point doesn't respect that. Like entry point runs as an init container, and it seems to run as root regardless.
I think
seems
part
like
of this is also that our entry point script, if you want to bring that up, there's a point where it compares the arguments provided. And it's right there in the same file. The arguments provided and the UID to decide whether to set up Postgres. And that's probably where we're running into this difference in arguments. So so to close things up real quick, we'll try and get pod utils up and running. We'll see if we can't modify the args to just have a simple entry point and likely just run as root, because this does allow us, when we run as root, to chown, and then if our first argument on line 51 is Postgres, it will do the init DB that we were currently lacking. So either we weren't running as root or either the DB wasn't getting set up, and we need probably both those if statements to trigger, including the one on 30, looks like line 32.
Okay.
Thank you for that help.
Yep.
The one other issue that we have is related to did it get on there? Was it?
Yes,
issue?
advanced audit policy, this thing.
It is so much fun. In order for us to correctly measure the amount of conformance coverage that we have, we need to have the audit policy not remove stuff for us. However, the recommended, or at least it's not documented anywhere, but there is a variable that says, please set this to override the audit policy, and it's all deep in that ticket. I have gone through and run that manually, like the script, and generated the audit policy. It is a valid audit policy, but when you look at the logs, it says this is it's missing values or invalid YAML. And I've not also, another on our Prow cluster, I have not been able to get up or running with PR kind, or run Prow jobs on kind, the ability to run Google jobs like this in order for me to be able to debug it. Plus the scripts are pretty, it's hairy.
Are you saying you can't get kind to run on your cluster? That's something we can also follow up with offline.
Kind will run. It's the jobs that were, so this isn't a kind job. And another thing I thought about is, rather than trying to modify this Google job, let's modify the kind conformance job so we don't have to run it in Google and I can run it locally. But we need to modify and have an audit policy so that it logs and creates the audit log in the same way that the other jobs do upstream. Because we consume that audit log and bring it into API Snoop DB to see the user agents that are passed to the API server to calculate coverage. That would be my preference, honestly. Right now, we're using this job because it is the primary signal indicator for conformance, but I am very keen to use something simpler.
Yeah, it's a release blocking job.
Yeah. I don't think the kind conformance one is release blocking, but it would generate the data that I need, I'm pretty sure. I'm look forward to your input on what direction we should head with regards to which job, and if we should try hard to patch versus debugging why the YAML file that gets generated, which looks valid, is not getting consumed by API server.
I mean, finding out why it's not valid seems like something we ought to be able to do. I don't know if that's the correct password though. I'd probably want someone else's opinion on which jobs we should use, as given my inherent bias.
Let's see, kind passes conformance, so we could use kind.
It's valid.
What's happening here is what you would do for the next step of debugging this job is I would recommend you use cluster kube.sh, or you could even run this on your Pro instance where you're going to have more access to SSH to things. You could probably set it up so instead of automatically tearing the cluster down, you could modify the job so it just leaves the cluster up, and then you could go SSH to the node in question and see for yourself what the YAML actually is on that node.
I sort of did that. I ran this job, but I set the entry point to sleep and the arg to infinity and ran the generation of the YAML file and pulled that out and used kind, and the policy was fine. So it was something else is happening. Again, we probably need to figure out how to get pod utils up in such a way in Prow, which is running on AWS, to start up the Google credentials correctly, because without those pod utils, we're not going to get the things mounted that we need.
Yeah. So if this is just about capturing API audit logs, you could always do that with kind. That's true. I know what API Snoop has been doing in the past is looking at like the default jobs audit logs versus the conformance jobs audit logs. So you get coverage of what has been tested versus what is tested with conformance tests. And the reason we said no, don't put events in the audit logs is because Kubernetes generates a lot of events and the audit logs get huge and there are performance implications. So we don't want to slow down our default release blocking tests. But that seems valid for confirming that conformance tests cover what they say they're covering. And if kind can do that, that seems like a friendlier, faster approach.
I have a link. It's actually on CNCF API Snoop, the repo. There's a kind folder, and that has the kind config and the audit policy. If we could just find a way to update the existing conformance job for kind to do this, and we just need to figure out where the logs go, because I'm not sure, but that would get us across the line.
You're cut.
We're kind of losing you, but I think
to make a lot of changes.
In addition, we have a couple of other items on the agenda to hit up, and we're kind of running out of time, I think.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I think I would say look at using kind for this. That seems like a faster approach. Wading into debugging cluster kubeup seems like the other approach if we want to continue using kubeup. Okay, Andrew, you asked to create a new repo called E2E Framework in Kubernetes SIGs. I'm not going to lie, the only reason I haven't slapped my +1 on this is because I'm wondering if we should use the existing repo we have in Kubernetes SIGs called testing frameworks. Which apparently is retired. Never mind. So yeah, we should probably create a new repo. Do you want to speak to it a little more? I know we've chatted about this in group chats, but I don't know if it's chatted to more people.
That's pretty much.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I can try to be quick here since we're low on time. So
that's the right place to bring it up.
Yeah. Okay. So to just add more context, there was some work that was being done by Alejandro and Tim and I sometime last year, and the main motivation from my end. So the work we're trying to do was we're trying to take the internal end-to-end testing framework in Kubernetes and move it to a place where it's more easily consumable from for cloud providers, CSI drivers, and kind of the entire ecosystem that has been writing E2E tests based on that. And so the main motivation was let's move that. The first motivation was let's move that thing to staging so that things can depend on it without pulling in all the Go depths from Kubernetes. And then I know SIG testing folks here had concerns around moving the current E2E framework to somewhere that's more publicly consumable. And so the alternative that we kind of landed on was, okay, let's just build a really minimal end-to-end testing framework from the ground up that is going to address cloud providers, CSI drivers, and other projects that need some sort of like base end-to-end testing framework but may not necessarily want to pull in the giant framework that's in Kubernetes today. And so hence I'm making this request to put something in Kubernetes SIG.
Yeah. The only other thing I feel like came up in our discussion is you wanted to make it clear that this was experimental. You're looking for some place to kind of experiment and iterate before sort of declaring, okay, this is the way, let's all use this.
Yeah, well, we should definitely have some like big warning signs to say don't use this yet. We're gonna break it until we're happy with it. So yeah, agreed. I know some folks have strong opinions around what libraries and tools to use. So definitely want to hear input about that as well.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, one quick question. This is for the whole E2E framework or for the cloud provider and all these external dependencies testing?
I think that's TBD. I think,
okay.
Yeah. So I think the starting point is like getting the test runners up and running, like wiring, kubectl and all this stuff. And then we probably do want some sort of like pluggable interface for doing like cloud provider operations to test certain behaviors. But yeah, I think that's TBD at the moment.
Thank you.
This solves that all the cloud providers need to move out, but they've been using the in-tree testing. But we don't necessarily, like, while we're maybe moving the providers themselves out, we're not necessarily moving the, the test binary and framework out. I super appreciate taking this approach. I think, if nothing else, I'm really hopeful that this proves out as like a testing ground for ideas. Even if it winds up being cloud provider testing specific, we may know what we want to do to provide something for any other use cases based on how this goes. Like we don't necessarily have to make this one completely general. Which is probably my only comment is maybe if we are focused on the cloud providers, we might even want to tweak the name to suggest that.
Yeah, I'd be open to like reevaluating that if it turns out to be just something that we tell cloud providers to use and it's only for cloud providers, we can definitely repurpose the repo.
Yeah, I'm hopeful it won't be, but I'm also, given the already big ask of trying something different here, I wouldn't want to block on getting too obsessed with being general.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I slapped my +1 on there as a chair. I want to be super respectful of everybody's time and thank you all for staying 3 minutes late. Thank you all for your time. I look forward to seeing you all on November 10th. Happy Tuesday.
Happy
Thanks,
Tuesday.
everyone.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks, everybody.